Good evening. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Hi, good evening. Thank you for your support for our podcast. And this is Kevin from the Center for Responsible Tourism Singapore. If you have tuned in to our podcast before, you will have known that we have quite a few podcasts done in the past on climate change and also a few on intangible cultural heritage. And if I remember correctly, there was one on climate change and intangible cultural heritage. Today, my podcast attempts to look at the relationship between, or the possible relationship that could lie between regenerative tourism, climate change, and intangible cultural heritage. And incidentally, my PhD topic is, or my potential PhD topic is very similar to what I've just said, but specifically looking at one or two examples of intangible cultural heritage, or what we call ICH. And so it is with pleasure, although a little bit of pressure too, to talk about this topic, because this topic is still largely unexplored. But I'm interested to see and to study and to discover how regenerative tourism, a form of tourism that has been sometimes touted or mentioned as sustainable tourism 2.0, how this concept or this form of tourism can potentially become or seem to be suitable in helping to reduce the effects of climate change on the intangible aspects of our heritage and culture. So let me give you some background before we dive into the main discussion. Intangible cultural heritage refers to the intangible aspects of our culture and heritage, and that includes things like oral traditions, like language and music, the intangible part of rituals and customs, practices, ideas, and knowledge, and methods of cooking and the ways to prepare food, which sometimes could be part tangible and intangible. So all these are examples of ICH, and the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, has been talking about the importance of ICH and safeguarding and preservation of ICH quite a bit over the last 2 decades. And so it is with increasing attention that the global society, and also including the tourism industry, perhaps the tourism industry has only really stepped in to look at this thing quite lately. Regenerative tourism, something that is quite contemporary, could be seen as the form of tourism that may provide some form of answer, if not solutions, to contribute to safeguarding ICH in a world where we are witnessing worsening effects of climatic changes. So safeguarding intangible cultural heritage, to begin with, is something that is important, but however is complicated. It's complicated because ICH differs from places to places and from groups of people one to another. Protection or safeguarding of ICH is complicated because there are places where resource scarcity happens, and there are places where resource scarcity has happened for a long time and happened in a worse manner. Safeguarding intangible cultural heritage is never straightforward because it involves a lot of stakeholders. It is important because it helps to protect and to preserve the heritage and the cultural identity of different groups of people, and including groups or population of people like the ethnic groups and the indigenous people. And some of these groups whose population are dwindling and is currently at very low numbers. Safeguarding ICH also involves thinking about reducing the vulnerability of places and people when it comes to having the intangible aspects of the heritage and culture being lost. And when we talk about vulnerability, it has strong links to the availability or the loss of resources. So helping places and communities of people to reduce their vulnerability to vulnerability to things like climate change, and strengthening the adaptive capacity that places and people have towards the effects of climate change. And so we're talking about reducing vulnerability and strengthening adaptive capacity. Two things that should happen both simultaneously. And in one of the earlier podcasts that I did about 1.5 years ago, I actually talked about this. I actually spoke about how tourism, interestingly, can be something that comes in to play a direct or an indirect, or both direct and indirect roles to reduce vulnerability of people to the effects of climate change and to strengthen their adaptive capacity to the effects of climate change. The second thing that I want to talk about is that climate change has unequal effects on different communities of people. We all know that climate change is a global phenomenon. And this global phenomenon or crisis, interestingly but unfortunately, has very unequal impacts on different places and different people. There will be some places who will face harsher impacts because of their geographical locations or the makeup of the places that they are in. So that complicates the safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage. And that at the same time will also make the job of reducing vulnerability and strengthening their adaptive capacity more complicated. Climate change also changes the way we perceive and understand safeguarding of ICH. As climate change worsens and produces more complicated and complex impacts, as we continue to discover that there are many things we are learning about climate change, we're also discovering that there are some things that we don't quite have an answer to. And it changes the way we perceive and understand not just climate change, but it changes the worsening effects of climatic changes will change the way we perceive and understand safeguarding. Perhaps 10 years from now, how we perceive and how we understand safeguarding of ICH might change at least slightly. And so we come to the part where we bring in more of this thing called regenerative tourism. How does regenerative tourism fit into this whole thing? Regenerative tourism is about going to a place and when you leave, you actually play a part in making these places better than when you first came. And interestingly, the effects of your contributions during your stay will mostly or largely not be seen or not be known straight away. Regenerative tourism could be something that is quite suitable for reducing the effects climate change has on ICH. And one of the main reasons why I say that is because this is a form of tourism that is not just concerned about reducing the negative impacts, but regenerative tourism is a way of doing tourism that forces us to look into ways, and oftentimes innovative ways, to see how places can be strengthened, to see how places and communities who live in these places can benefit, and how these places can benefit more from tourism, and how the positive impacts can be made more, and how the positive impacts can be strengthened. So this form of tourism, or this concept called regenerative tourism, therefore will surely have to take into consideration contemporary crises like climate change. If climate change is going to have a worse and worse impact and a bigger challenge on the safeguarding and protection of intangible heritage and culture, then we can say that regenerative forms of travel will also have a bigger and bigger responsibility to explore innovative ways of how travel and tourism, of how the different things tourists do, the different tourist activities that are made available, how all these can play a part in coming out with clever and very creative solutions on how we can safeguard intangible cultural heritage better, on how we can overcome all the previous challenges like the unequal effects on communities, which makes the safeguarding of ICH complicated. As regenerative tourism progresses, and as more and more places start to understand and practice this form of tourism, we will have a better and stronger understanding of how it connects to things like global warming and rising sea levels. As practitioners and the tourism industry as a whole dive deeper into regenerative tourism, we will find better partnerships. We will find better and more innovative solutions to overcome the barriers. We will be able to come out with we will be able to come up with solutions and answers that will create opportunities for different communities in different destinations on how safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage can be carried out in a way that has more equity, in a way where we can talk more about the opportunities rather than the disadvantages. As I study this deeper and as I look at this more and more in the coming few years, expect more podcasts on this topic or topics similar. Have a blessed Lunar New Year ahead. It's coming next weekend. This is Kevin from the Center for Responsible Tourism signing off. Thank you. Thank you for your support. Bye-bye.